This morning's scripture reading helps to bring to mind the many different ways that we hear the good news. And the ways that we hear so many different things. And it caused me to ask the question, how are we hearing the good news? What are those things that we hear? And I know that as we think about the many different ways that we can hear anything, we recognize that there are so many more ways to hear or to get information overload today than we ever did in the past. You now have Twitter accounts, you have YouTube, you have Facebook, you have the internet, you have cable TV. All of these are ways of hearing some sort of news. So we ask what kind of news we're receiving. And the newest one is, of course, tweeting. And I don't do much tweeting. I'm wondering if there's anyone out there who tweets. And you know, if you do a lot of tweeting, you're a Twitter, right? Or a tweet. Someone, not a twit, but a tweeter is the way that goes. But it was interesting to hear that last year in 2011, this is interesting, that there was an average of 250 million tweets per day. That was pretty amazing, tweets per day, which means that there's over 3,000 tweets happening every second. That's amazing how many tweets are happening right now, even as we speak. And these get pretty serious. Even during the Olympics, somebody was arrested because of the tweets they were sending to the diver, you know, in England. And they were to figure out what his account was and where he was, and they arrested him for the tweets that he was sending. So tweets are serious stuff, right? What's interesting also is the type of news that we get. There are now 10% of our population more are watching their news through the internet than through other media, either printed or television. Which means that the most people are watching the internet to get their news. That's pretty amazing. The other thing that's interesting is Facebook now accounts for over 25% of all paid advertising. Imagine that, Facebook. 25% of all paid advertising is coming through Facebook. So the demographics of how people hear is changing. We're getting it through internet, we're getting it through Facebook, we're getting it through tweets, and this is changing the dynamics of how we hear anything. And so the question is, how is it that we hear the gospel? We know that there's many different types of ways that we can hear any kinds of news, but actually hearing the gospel comes to us in a different format than it did before. And so how is it that we hear? And the gospel, or the story that we read today here in Romans, gives us a lot of things to think about when it comes to how we hear what the text is and how it is that we hear faith. And the first thing that he describes is what I'll call an obstacle to hearing faith. And the biggest obstacle to hearing faith is a recognition that sometimes we get in our mind that faith comes by what we do. That somehow we're going to be saved by our works. And he describes this as the Mosaic law, or the Mosaic legalism, in the sense that Moses writes about the faith that comes by the law, and that says those who live by the law will do it. You know, they'll do those kind of things. And, you know, we're reading in the scripture from Genesis, it says that for Abraham, it was credited to him as righteousness as he believed. And so he's making this contrast between Moses, who's saying that you will have faith as you do out the law, as you do this legalistic living it out, or Abraham, who says, I'm going to believe God in His promises, and that's going to provide the righteousness that comes by faith. But what's interesting about this idea of legalism is we often, in the Christian church, kind of put legalism as a straw man that we kind of beat up on. Because we say, well, anyone who's doing this works righteousness is obviously not going to be saved, and so we thrust all kinds of bad things on it. But what's interesting is how much effort is spent by all of us in trying to attain our righteousness by work. Whether or not we believe it or not, we somehow have in the mindset that we still need to work it out. Yes, we know that Christ has paid for my sins, but I still feel like I've got to do a bunch of stuff in order to be good enough. And here in Romans, Paul puts it this way, do not say who is going to ascend into heaven, or do not ask who's going to descend into hell. And the way I translate that in my own mind is sometimes we find ourselves asking the question, well, do you think I'm going to be saved? And we put ourselves on this interesting, theological scale, whether or not we're good enough, our good deeds are going to somehow outweigh our bad deeds. And we get ourselves on this interesting scale. And in the Jewish concept of legalism, there was three classifications of individuals. You had the persons who obviously had good deeds. And there's the righteous Jewish person, right? And they obviously had enough good deeds that their good deeds were outweighing their bad, and so they were good. And then you had others who were obviously bad. They'd done evil things in their life, and so their bad deeds had outweighed their good. And then there were some who were kind of in the middle, who were maybe just one good step away from balancing the scale in a good direction. And that was the legal code that was out there. And so we ask ourselves the question, who's going to be saved? Is that person going to be saved, or this person's going to be saved? And Paul tells us, that asking that question is telling us that when we're asking the question, we're basing our salvation on some sort of works righteousness. But even if we're not using that question, I think about the struggle that many of us have as we're talking about our AA community or the 12-step community, where we still wrestle with so many different areas of our lives that still seem to have power over our lives. I watched the movie Bill W., and in that movie it describes how he had kind of come to the realization that no matter how much effort, no matter how much struggle or how much program he'd gone through, it was as if he just kept on failing over and over and over again. I wonder in your own life if you ever experienced that, where you just keep trying your best, but it doesn't seem to match up. It doesn't seem to work out for you. You're just doing the best you possibly can, but you continue to find yourself stuck under this somehow rigid law that you're not going to succeed. And what was amazing, Bill W.'s experience was when he finally was in the rehab clinic, in his detox center. He's sitting there on the bed, and a friend had come and talked to him, and they were talking about how bad the situation was. And when he left, he said to himself, he said, I am finally done. I am broken. I finally surrender. I'm done with it. And he finally recognized that in his own power, his own strength, he could no longer keep trying. He has seen that road. He's seen what's happened, and his best efforts, it's continued to fail. But finally he said, I'm done with it. And he said in that moment when he finally surrendered and said to God, he said, God, I need your help. He said it was as if this wind rushed into that room, and it was as if he got elevated from that detox center into the top of a mountainside, and he felt the fresh air come around him. And suddenly he felt that, yes, I'm not alone in this, and that my whole world has been transformed, that there is now power available to me that I didn't know was available before. And that's when he finally recognized his brokenness and said, I can't do it anymore. But even in our Christian walk, I think so many of us keep trying to do the good cycle thing. We keep thinking if we're good enough, we can outbeat the bad cycle. And we got this scale even if we're not using it. And finally, when we recognize that we are broken, and we're willing to admit to each other that we are broken, then we can say, I'm done. I can surrender. And when we finally hear that, we recognize that the first obstacle that Paul is describing here, and that is the legalistic tendency for us to put faith into this box of what I can do in order to get saved. Putting the whole weight of how I'm saved on my own strength and my own ability to think it out and ability to do it is based on my work. In fact, when Jesus is talking to the disciples and he says, not all who call on me, Lord, Lord, will be saved. And we kind of scratch our head. Well, what does this mean? And he says, they will say to him on that day, but Lord, I cast out demons in your name, and I did miracles in your name, and I fed the hungry in your name, and I did these wonderful things. And Jesus says, begone with me, for I've never known you. You see, even in their statements, they are saying, all the things that I've done that are good, even in the casting out demons and the feeding the homeless and all these sorts of things, all these things were based on the work that they had done. But Jesus says, I've never known you. Turning the corner, we recognize that it's not about legalistic work that has the corner, what faith is all about. Instead, there's a change that is being asked for us by God, and that is a change in the relationship. Initially, that obstacle is the relationship of being the creditor, somebody who's in debt to the creditor. And that is what we think of in the legalistic righteousness, is how can I make up the debt of the sin in my life in order to be right before God? But the relationship that God is asking for is not a relationship of a creditor to the debtor, but a relationship of a father to his child. As we've been talking about in Romans, it says to us, he says that he has foreknown us and he has called us into adoption as his children. Now, my son, I love him dearly. And for all the wonderful 5 years of life that we have provided for his housing, if he were to come up to me and say, Dad, I want to pay you back for all the good deeds that you've done in my life. Right? And he pulled into his pocket and he pulled out something. And I don't know what my son would pull out of his pocket. He's 5 years old. It could be slimy. I mean, you never know what that's going to be when he pulls out of his pocket. But I can guarantee that whatever he pulls out of his pocket, I won't receive. Because even the most cherished thing that he pulls out of his pocket in order to somehow pay me back is going to be an affront to the sense that I've called him to be my son in an atmosphere and relationship of love, not out of work. And in that same way, we pull out our best possible work righteousness and say, but God, I gave $2 to the Salvation Army. And God says, but I've called you to be my child. Haven't you heard that? Haven't you believed that I've called you? And once you've believed and received that, then you know that you are my own. And that $2 is great, but really I'm calling you into a relationship and not into a credit-debt relationship. Now you are my own. And so the obstacle that Paul is describing here is that we somehow get ourselves in the mindset of legalism, and that obstacle becomes like putty in the ears. Somehow we're not able to hear that, and so he wants us to unplug the putty of legalism in our ears so that we can hear what it is that God is calling us to. Now, I can tell you this fun story about being in Russia and working with somebody who couldn't hear, who worked in a Navy boat during World War II, and he had all sorts of putty in his ears, and how we helped him hear was to clean out that putty, was the process of healing in his life. But he's also talking about this obstacle of distance. He says, who is going to try to ascend into heaven in order to hear the good news, or descend into the abyss, the depths of hell, in order to hear the good news? And what he's describing here is the distance of when Moses is describing to the people, the Israelites, when he brings the law. And he says, God has not given you some obscure law that you're unable to follow, but rather it is near to you. It is provided before you that you might follow it. Too often, people kind of think, I want to please God, or I want to do what God wants me to do, but I have no idea what it is. And so they think of the hardest, most difficult thing on the planet that they can do in order to please God. In Douglas Adams' book on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, there's this great planet in which it shows the whole species of all the universe comes to this planet where God has put His final message for all of the universe. And He's emblazoned it on the side of a cliff, but you have to climb up this giant mountain in order to see God's final message to all of the world, to all of the universe. And he describes going up this steep cliff to the top of this mountainside, and you've got people who are crawling because they want to show their attrition or their suffering as they get to the top of the mountain. And you have even other types of species doing different kinds of things in order to get to the top of this mountainside. And when they finally get to the top of the mountain and see the message that God has provided for them, it says simply, sorry for all the inconvenience. God doesn't want us to try to do something incredibly difficult to somehow please Him. Instead, God provides for us. He says, what I've given you is near to you. And how near is it? He says simply, it is on your lips and it's in your heart. Now, what could be nearer to you than your own lips and your own heart? I mean, even if you're kissing another person, that's a little far away. You try to get close. But I mean, still, that's distance. But what can be nearer to us than our own lips and our own heart? It's within us. And so he's saying it's not something far away. And so God has provided for us what I'm going to call hearing aids in order for us to hear the good message of what He has for us. And the two hearing aids He's provided for us is first our lips and then secondly our heart. And He tells us how we tune in our hearing aids in order to hear the message of what He wants us to hear. And the first tune in is our lips. And He says, for those who confess with their lips that Jesus is Lord shall be saved. Now, the statement, Jesus is Lord, could be seen in a number of ways, but in the word for Lord, He is showing that this is a word of respect, a word that was given to as Sir, but it was also given to address Roman emperors. It was also given as a sense of deity, as into Roman gods, but it was given uniquely for Jesus in terms of Him being the Messiah. The one who saved, the one who came to seek and save the lost. That is what He means by Lord. And so when we use the term Lord today, some of the words we use that correlate with that, we might use the word coach, we might use the word boss, we might use the word master, but we're saying that Jesus Christ has a unique place in our life, a unique place in which Christ has the ability to tell us in our life where we need to make the change. He has the authority. We're saying He is the ultimate authority in my life. Christ is Lord of my life. The other thing he says is not only is that Jesus is Lord, but we must declare that He has been risen from the dead. Now this is different from saying, I believe that Jesus existed. I remember being in Chicago. We were doing an evangelistic crusade. We were visiting with people on the street and sharing with them about the gospel. And one woman I approached, I said, well, you were out here just talking about Jesus? And she goes, oh yeah, I believe He may have existed. And I kept thinking, that's just the weirdest response I've heard. It's sort of like saying, yeah, I kind of think that we had a pope, or I kind of think that we have a president in the United States. It's like I'm going to believe it, and it might be true. It's sort of like Sherwood of Nottingham, whether or not there is such a thing as Robin Hood. That was kind of the same sense of how she was saying it. But we're saying something different when we recognize that Jesus is risen from the dead. We're not saying, yeah, we just believe that there was some historical event of the resurrection, but we're saying that Jesus is really alive. Not just that He had died in the past tense, but that He is alive today. And that we are the ones who are following Him, that He is the Lord of my life today. And that if He is alive to me. And that in that realizing that He is alive, that means that there's a relationship that's ongoing. It is also a statement of victory. We're saying not only that Jesus died and paid for my sins, but Jesus has been risen from the dead, saying that He is victorious over all things in life. He was victorious over death, but then if I believe that He was victorious over death, which is the ultimate, we recognize He might also be victorious over those small areas of struggle in my own life. And we say that if Jesus Christ is Lord over life, and we say He's Lord over my life, then I have to ask the question, am I letting Jesus be truly the Lord of my life? Or do I do that sort of Christian thing where I come to church on Sunday morning, and for at least that hour, between 9:30 and 10:30, Jesus is Lord of my Sunday morning hour. But that's not where it ends. Jesus wants for Him to be the Lord of your life, going from not just Sunday morning, but into the areas of our lives where we continue to have relationship with others. Are we letting Jesus be the Lord of our life in our marriages, in our relationship with others, in our friendships? Do we let Jesus be Lord even in our workplace? Yeah, I'm starting to meddle with people's stories here. Letting Jesus come into that workplace and to allow Him to give direction to how you live your life there. Or when you're not around church folks, do you act a different way when you're not with church folks or when you are with your friends? Jesus says, I am Lord, and if we're saying Jesus is Lord of my life, we're saying Jesus is Lord over all the various areas of my life. We are declaring through our actions, through our words, that Jesus is not only been raised from the dead, but He's actively alive and victorious in each and every area of my life. Now we recognize that even as Christians we continue to struggle, but as we apply the truth of who Christ is to each and every area of our life, we slowly begin to find victory. In the same way that Christ had to die on the cross, sometimes God asks us to let go, to let us die to our own ambitions. Let us die to those things that we're struggling with and holding on to, so that they might come about to a new form of resurrection, that God might bring life to those areas that we experience death in our own lives. So that the first hearing aid is for us to tune up our lips, to apply that, the lip gloss to all the various areas of our life so that they might be applied to how we live that out. But the other hearing aid He has for us is our heart. He says we need to tune in our heart and believe in God. Believe not only in the resurrection and the proof of His life today, but also that we might believe that we have been justified. Now, the word justified, I've talked about before, is God making the declaration to us that we have been just as if we had not sinned. Now, I think that is a key piece of the heart, is how do we understand ourselves? Because I think so often, once we've finally recognized that we have been saved, we allow for that truth of being saved to only apply to what happens in a small part of our life. But when we really realize that God has set us free, that means that when we come into contact with those other areas of our lives that had formerly bogged us down, then we need to allow for that justification to take place, to be truly setting us free in each of those areas of our lives. And this is God making the declaration. This isn't us saying, now I am set free. This is God's declaration that indeed you have been set free indeed. So God is making the declaration of our heart that He has set us free, that we have been justified. And the way I kind of put it this way is in our heart, God is making the declaration that you are set free, that you have been justified. and with our lips, then we are making the declaration. He says, for with our lips we confess that He is Lord. Now the word confession isn't to make up a story, is it? The word confession means to admit to what is true. Now, some people would say, well, Jesus Christ is Lord in your life, and that's good for you, but for me it's something else. For me it's, media, or it's a different religion, or something else. That's okay for me, because that's what's true for me, but Jesus is Lord in your life, that's nice for you. But when we're saying we're confessing that Jesus is Lord, we're not saying that He's just Lord for me, we're confessing the truth of what already is. We're admitting, we're being witness to, giving testimony to the fact that Christ is the Lord over all life. Now, in that way, just as God has declared the truth of who we are in Him, that we've been set free, we are now declaring in our confession that now God is true in all life, that God is the Lord of all things, that He has risen from the dead. And so we confess with our lips, and that tunes us in to hear the idea that it is by faith that we have been saved. It is not by own works. Because once we have tuned in our heart to believe and to recognize His Lordship, and that He is indeed the Lord over all life, it begins to recognize that if it is God who has done the work for us, then anything that we have done is nothing in comparison to that. That God has done all things so that we might be saved, and our work is His rubbish. We recognize that we have to tune in our hearts and our lips in order to say, yes, I'm going to believe God. Just in the same way that Abraham believed God's promise to him that he would bring about his children, in the same way that God had promised to Abraham that He would do that, and Abraham believed that, so when we hear that God says, I will save you, that I will bring about the salvation in your life, once we recognize that we can believe that promise, that becomes the rock of salvation. That becomes the testimony of knowing that we are saved. Now some of us still, even after hearing that, wonder, well, can all people be saved? Can I be saved? Is there such a thing that various persons, is it possible for somebody to get so far gone that they cannot be saved? Well, Paul addresses this in verses 11 through 13 by simply saying this. He says, no one who believes in Him will be put to shame. He says there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. There is the same Lord over all. There's no status, no upper-class Christian and lower-class Christian. In the Jewish mindset, they had thought somehow they were closer to God because God had given them the law through Moses, and they were like the first-class Christians. Right? There's no distinction of class or status. He says, for no one who believes in the Lord will be put to shame. And in verse 13 he says, for everyone who calls on the Lord will be saved. Everyone who calls on the Lord will be saved. In our own mind, sometimes we think, well, that's good for most of us, but we know this person's dealing with this addiction, or this person's got sort of a mental handicap, or this person's got this sort of thing going on in their life. And so we kind of say, well, let's not even bother sharing the good news with those persons. But the message is very clear. The message is for all. The message is for all persons that might be willing to hear the good news. In fact, it is by faith that we hear. It is by hearing that we have faith. And so it is that we have this task that Paul leaves us with. He says, for how shall they call on the one whom they are to call on unless they hear of His name? We as the church are the ones who are both the ones who receive the good news and believe in the good news, but we're also the ones who are called to be sent. The idea is that we are not just to send out missionaries, that the church itself is a missional church. That each and every one of us has the opportunity to share of that good news. Just as we tune in our hearts to hear of His love, we tune in our hearts to hear of His goodness for us. So God asks us to take that step into the world, to share the testimony and the confession of our lives as we find freedom in our own lives, how we might share that with others. The work of the Christian church is to help to plead with humanity, that they might unplug their ears, to put away the obstacles of hearing the gospel, of hearing God's abundant love, of the notion that God has called us into that relationship, and that as we put on that recognition, that we have a task in compliance and accord and being in step with God's work in the world, we have the opportunity to be co-missionaries with God as He calls the whole world into an awareness of His presence. Now that requires something of our end, and that is the end of obedience. To ask ourselves the question, who is it that God might ask me to share the message with? Are those people around me that I have been in relationship with, have I not been willing to bear confession, to bear witness, to give testimony in their lives about what God is doing in my life? Or is that too hard? Here he says, how can they go unless they are sent? I think one of the amazing things as the Methodist Church is we have spent a lot of time thinking about the gospel. Many of us have spent a lot of time doing Bible study and analyzing, how Jesus is going to come back again. I keep hearing about Bible studies about exploring the relationship of when Jesus is going to come back and save the Jewish people, and that's supposed to be the greatest study that's happening this next quarter. I'm thinking, that's not the point. But we haven't spent any time sending the church. Because the truth is that each and every one of you is being sent. God has put within you the gifts, talents, and abilities. You have hands and feet and lips and eyes and ears. All of you are without disability. That's an amazing thing to say to a congregation. And even if we had disability, God would still be equipping us to send us. But God is sending you to share the good news. God has equipped you, given you the ability and talents and grace to share this good news. And we come on Sunday morning and we celebrate that good news, but we recognize there are so many more persons in our community who continue to struggle with this concept of, how am I going to work out my salvation? They beat themselves up thinking they're not good enough. They beat themselves up and they beat up other people because they're afraid of the judgment and the wrath that is placed upon them. And we are called to be the light bearers, to give the good news. So I begin the sermon by asking you, how have you heard the good news? But now I have to ask you the question, how are you speaking the good news? Because they tie together. Just as we hear the good news, God now calls us to bear the good news. To be the ones who share the victories over the darkness in our lives. The ones who share the fact that, I finally gave up the sense that I no longer have power over that area of my life. The brokenness that I continue to experience, I finally surrendered to God, and here I have found victory. Now, this isn't saying I'm not going to go out and be boastful about what I've experienced. I like the way it's stated when it says, we are as Christians as one beggar sharing with another beggar where to find bread. Simply that we have experienced something of the goodness of God, and this is how I found it. With that in mind, I invite us to stand as we sing our song of response, For I Know Whom I Have Believed. And this is hymn 711.